Welcome to our special event, Chemotherapy, Fact versus Fiction. I'm your host, Jonathan Landsman, and today our intention is to create a program that will give you a lot of information about chemotherapy. We have a situation where people get diagnosed with cancer and it's a rush situation. Get surgery, do your chemotherapy, and get your radiation right away. Not a lot of thought is given about what chemotherapy really is and what its track record is. I'm joined today by Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez. Dr. Gonzalez, welcome.
Nice to be here, Jonathan. Thanks for having me on this video interview.
I'm sure you would agree. I've had a lot of people do programs about cancer, and I don't want you to misunderstand what we're doing today. This is not about bashing chemotherapy. It's to give you the information that you need to make an informed decision. In fact, I would say, and I'd like to get your comments on this, Dr. Gonzalez, that if you thought chemotherapy was the best way for you to go, then that's what you should do. For instance, I've done programs with Dr. Bernie Siegel, who's a very well-known cancer surgeon, and he's talked about this quite a bit, that if you felt chemotherapy was better than some of these natural therapies, I mean, you really didn't want to do anything in a natural realm, then that's what you ought to do, is do the chemotherapy treatment. Dr. Gonzalez, what do you tell patients when you get this sense that your protocol, your ideas doesn't really fit what they want to do, and they just feel more comfortable doing chemotherapy? What would you tell them?
They should absolutely do chemotherapy. One of the things we do in our office, a primary rule in our office, a first principle, is we never talk people into doing our treatment. The single most important determinant as to how a patient does whatever they choose, moon dust, my therapy, Sloan Kettering, is their belief system. If they don't fundamentally believe in what I do or what alternative practitioners do, whether I think they should or not, doesn't matter. They shouldn't do it. If they don't believe in it, if they believe Sloan Kettering has the answer, MD Anderson has the answer, Massachusetts General Hospital has the answer, that's where they should be. I've actually had patients in my office that were pushed there by family members, well-intentioned family members, well-intentioned friends, their postman, their health food store owner, when they really wanted to be at Sloan Kettering. And I've been doing this for 26 years. I picked that up right away. And I very gently say, you sure you want to be here? And they kind of relax because they think I understand. And it turns out they've been pushed there. They'd rather be at Sloan Kettering, even if I think that's their worst choice in terms of their particular cancer, in terms of conventional medicine. I say that's where you should go. Sloan Kettering's 30 blocks north of my office. That's where you should be. Patients should always do what they feel is best for them, what they believe in their most, what their faith is, where their faith is. Don't choose a therapy because someone else told you to do it or because you read an article and someone else said you should take that article seriously. Do it because you believe in it, whether it's my therapy or somebody else's or conventional therapy.
And that's what we're talking about here. This program is designed to give you information. It is completely up to you to make the right decision that's best for you in your treatment program. And I look forward to our conversation, Dr. Gonzalez.
I look forward to it as well.
Dr. Gonzalez, how was chemotherapy first developed?
It's a fascinating story which most oncologists don't even know. During World War II, the Department of Defense had all these stockpiles of nerve gas, which they weren't from World War I, and they weren't using them in World War II. And someone at the Department of Defense had this brilliant idea to try and convert these nerve gases into useful therapeutic modalities. And serendipitously, at the same time, it turned out a group of American soldiers were inadvertently exposed to some nerve gas at an experimental research center. And what they noticed at autopsies, because they died, is their white counts had all gone down and the bone marrow had been suppressed. So one of the Department of Defense doctors got this brilliant idea, this was about 1945, that perhaps you could use nerve gas, in this case it was nitrogen mustard, to treat leukemia and lymphoma and knock out the bone marrow, where the leukemias and lymphomas are diseases of the white cell line, and the nerve gas seemed to wipe it out. So the Department of Defense actually contracted Dr. Gilman at the Yale University, one of the preeminent pharmacologists of the day, gave him a huge amount of money to test it in animal models. So in 1946, Dr. Gilman up at Yale tested it in an animal model of lymphoma, and lo and behold, the tumors regressed. Of course, the animals all died, but it was very impressive. It was the first time in history that anyone had seen cancerous tumors regress from a drug treatment. So then they decided to try it on a patient. They had a patient with advanced lymphoma, and there were no treatments for lymphoma in 1946. So they gave him this nitrogen mustard derivative, and lo and behold, all his tumors regressed, which they thought was a miracle. Of course, 6 weeks later, he was dead. But it was an extraordinary event because it was the first time in medical history that doctors had witnessed and documented the regression of tumors in a patient with advanced disease. So they started to tweak it, and over the next 10, 15 years, they gradually developed a variety of drugs, beginning at Yale, but then it went to other medical centers, where they're using these toxic chemicals, ironically, from nerve gas. The original derivative was nerve gas used to kill people, as a therapeutic modality in chemotherapy. Very few people realize the whole generation of chemotherapeutic drugs that are being used today, and there are over 100 of them, really developed from poisonous nerve gas developed for warfare. And that's how it all began. It didn't develop out of anything good. Its origins are pretty unpleasant. But that's how it all began, with the Department of Defense contracting doctors to use their nitrogen mustard stores to see if they could use it to treat any kind of disease.
So why was the medical community so excited about something like this?
Well, when Goodman and Gilman published their results with the animal study showing regression of lymphomas in these animals, and when they published their first case report of this single patient, the medical community was absolutely enthralled because they didn't know of any drug that could reduce tumors. This was the first time in history where a drug therapy, a synthetic drug, had reduced tumors. And it was just an amazing event in medicine. It was in the newspapers, and there was no internet in those days, but it really spread around the world that the magic bullet was around the corner. Antibiotics at that time were coming into their own. A lot of it had to do with the general context of the time, where people were so enthusiastic about antibiotics, which really came to their own during World War II with all these soldiers with injuries. And antibiotics could reverse terrible infections. So researchers were looking for this magic bullet, this drug that would cause tumors to go away, just the way antibiotics were causing infectious diseases like pneumonia, terrible infections previously which had no treatment, to go away. And they thought they had it. They thought that this nitrogen mustard derivative was the next penicillin for cancer. And it was just, everything had come together. The extraordinarily effective antibiotics, which of course was overstated, and this one case report, and they said, we have the magic bullet for cancer.
I'm just wondering, if you were one of those doctors in the early 1900s, what would you have said about something like this chemotherapy invention?
Well, of course, I'm kind of unique in that I'm a skeptic and I tend to think outside the box. I would have been a little bit more cautious. And indeed, caution was warranted because chemotherapy did not develop as everyone had thought. It didn't become like antibiotics that would magically make tumors go away in a few weeks. And they were really misled by these initial reports. I would have been very cautious. I would have, of course, my own orientation, assuming I was the same person 40, 50, 70 years ago as I am today, I would have been always looking for something natural. And even in those days, there was evidence of natural approaches to cancer that were very effective. But the entire medical community was becoming enthralled by the drug approach. So I would have been cautious. I would have been a little bit skeptical. In science, skepticism can be beneficial. You don't rush to be the first person to accept a new therapy. You don't want to be the last person also to accept a good therapy. I would have been cautious. I would have waited for the research to develop. And as it turned out, the research was very slow in coming, proving results with most of the cancers.
I'm sure a lot of people don't even know about this, but when did chemotherapy actually get started as a sort of a standard method of treatment?
After the initial enthusiasm in the mid-1940s, it was really a very slow process because a lot of the initial enthusiasm was tainted by the fact that most patients weren't responding, that indeed if tumors shrank, patients would die. It wasn't until the late 1960s that the idea that chemotherapy had this magical effect on cancer really came into the fore. And it really, again, it's a single incident, was really the development of the MOPP, the MOP treatment for Hodgkin's disease. This was developed by Dr. Vincent DeVita, who at that time was working at the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda. And he was studying Hodgkin's disease. And he put a variety of chemotherapy drugs that had been already developed in the 1960s, a 4-drug regimen, and started treating advanced Hodgkin's disease. And lo and behold, it was like 1946 all over again, where all these tumors magically disappeared. Now, the interesting thing is, with some of these Hodgkin's patients, the results were long-standing, that they seemed to be cured. And this was the first time that there was a significant long-term effect from synthetic toxic chemicals. And Dr. DeVita deserves credit for that. I mean, again, to give the devil his due, it did work for a lot of these Hodgkin's patients. Up to 50% of the advanced cases seemed to respond beautifully for long periods of time. Yeah, there was toxicity. Yeah, there were side effects, of course. But Dr. DeVita's work with Hodgkin's really prompted a new enthusiasm for chemo. By the mid-1960s, a lot of the enthusiasm from the 1940s had kind of waned because they weren't getting the results that they thought they would. And Dr. DeVita really revived this whole new interest in the use of toxic synthetic medications in the treatment of cancer. Of course, it was kind of like 1946 again, all over again, because Hodgkin's is a very unique disease. It's one of the few of the 100 cancers that actually responds to chemo. It just happened to be the disease that he was working on, and it happened to be one of the few cancers that responds to toxic chemotherapy drugs. But again, as they did in 1946, the oncology establishment generalized. They assumed if chemotherapy could work so effectively for Hodgkin's disease, which in those days was a deadly illness, it must work for everything else, for all the other cancers. But that was an assumption that wasn't warranted and would turn to be erroneous. But because of Dr. DeVita's work, and his work specifically with Hodgkin's disease, and specifically his work with the MOP chemotherapy regimen, there was a burst of new enthusiasm.
So in your professional opinion, why would you say that chemotherapy is so ineffective for most types of cancer, especially at the stage 4 level?
There are over 100 different types of cancer, depending on which textbook you consult, and the great majority of them do not respond to chemotherapy. As it turns out, the cancers that respond to chemo are generally the blood-related cancers like leukemia and lymphoma. They're not that common compared to the major cancer killers. The major cancer killers like lung, colon, prostate, pancreatic, breast cancer do not respond to chemotherapy. The typical solid tumors, tumors of the breast, lungs, stomach, colon, pancreas, liver, uterus, ovaries, prostate, do not respond generally to chemotherapy. It's the rare cancers, like Hodgkin's is a very rare cancer. Lymphomas are not that common. Leukemias, rare cancers. They tend to respond to chemotherapy very nicely, and there's an interesting reason why. There are all kinds of theories about why chemo works when it does work and why it doesn't work when it doesn't, but actually chemotherapy, as the 1946 study showed, kind of wipes out the bone marrow. And leukemias, lymphomas, and multiple myeloma, the cancers that do respond to chemo, are diseases of the bone marrow. So with toxic chemo, you're actually knocking out the bone marrow. So of course these diseases will regress. But the other solid tumors, the major cancer killers, like tumors of the breast, lung, etc., they're not bone marrow cancers. So you can wipe out the bone marrow and the cancer's still going to grow because they don't derive from bone marrow stem cells. So for the great majority of the major cancer killers, chemotherapy is ineffective.
You know, Dr. Gonzalez, I've been in this industry for a long time, and we hear this over and over played in the mainstream media that we're winning the war on cancer. What would you say about something like this?
I guess people who say that must have a different definition of war and winning, certainly not the definitions I would use, unless it's like the 100 Years' War they're talking about from history. We're not really winning the war on cancer. The major cancer killers, as I mentioned, like tumors of the lung, which kills over 200,000 people a year, tumors of the breast, that kill 45,000 women a year, pancreatic cancer kills 45,000 people a year, colon cancer, it kills 50,000 people a year, prostate, 50,000. For these cancers, chemotherapy is not effective, and the therapies that are used today are really no more effective than therapies used 30 years ago. In fact, there are scientists who've studied cancer statistics, and they say the majority of patients that are cured today are the same patients that would have been cured 50 years ago by surgery when the tumor was found early, like in the colon of the breast, and they take it out. But for metastatic disease, the major cancer killers, again, the therapies they have, even though they're getting very expensive and very sophisticated, and the targeted therapies, you know, attacking specific biochemical patterns in the cells, they still don't prolong survival very much. So there really hasn't been much improvement in the survival of patients with metastatic solid tumor cancers. It just hasn't changed much. There's a lot of publicity. And I don't know how you can consider the war being won or winning the war when 600,000 people in America alone die of cancer each year. And it's not really improved very much. And the 5-year survivals have not improved that much. And there are statisticians like Dr. John Baylor, who worked at the NCI for 25 years, who said a lot of the so-called improvements in cancer are actually fudged statistics. Because of the great improvement in diagnostic techniques like CAT scans, MRIs, and PET scans, cancer is being diagnosed at an earlier stage. But when you actually look at the math, they're still dying at the same time. It just looks like they've survived longer because they were diagnosed earlier. Because, you know, 50 years ago, they didn't have CAT scans and MRIs and PET scans. So he feels a lot of the so-called improvements in cancer survival, when they're claimed, are just statistical manipulations. I mean, there are some improvement in some cancers, like with chronic myelocytic leukemia. There's a targeted therapy, Gleevec, which does prolong life. But for the major cancer killers, all the billions of dollars invested in research and all the publicity, the American Cancer Society fundraising programs have not led to any major great advancements, except for the same few cancers, leukemias and lymphomas, myelomas, testicular cancer, that respond to chemo. Those tumors responded to chemo 30 years ago, and they still do today, but the majority of other cancers do not.
This brings us to probably the most important part of the program, Dr. Gonzalez. A lot of people don't hear about what the real side effects are to a lot of these chemotherapy agents based on the type of cancer they have. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
All chemotherapy drugs, whether they're standard chemotherapy, targeted therapy, hormonal blockade as used in prostate or breast cancer, have terrible side effects. This has been well documented. There is no drug used to treat cancer that doesn't have serious side effects. Often the side effects are bone marrow suppression. Again, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. One reason they work with leukemias and lymphomas and myelomas, they suppress the bone marrow. Well, that's not good if you've got breast cancer or colon cancer and the bone marrow gets wiped out. You have no platelets, you can bleed to death, you can die of terrible anemia. So doctors have had to develop a whole line of drugs like Neupogen and Epogen to stimulate the bone marrow to start producing white cells and red cells, because you can die without those things. One of the problems with chemotherapy agents, when they wipe out the bone marrow, they wipe out your white cells, which are the cells that help you fight infectious disease. So cancer patients are notoriously prone to things like pneumonia and skin infections and rectal abscesses and all these terrible infections that can kill them, brain abscesses, because their white cells are dysfunctional. They've been wiped out by the chemo. So you have to watch these patients very carefully. Each drug has a specific list of side effects. There's certain drugs like Cytoxan can affect the kidney. Methotrexate can affect the kidney. Adriamycin and the adriamycin derivatives, which are used to treat breast cancer routinely, affect the heart. People die from heart failure from adriamycin. They're called the anthracycline derivatives. They can damage the heart and can kill people. So all these drugs have serious side effects. Methotrexate, which is commonly used to treat a lot of different types of cancer, affects the liver. Most of these drugs not only affect the bone marrow, but affect the liver. So you can end up with liver failure, which I've seen in patients who had chemo before they came to see me. They're in liver failure, kidney failure. They can get these serious side effects. Targeted therapies, which have been really promoted heavily, also have a lot of side effects. Avastin, which is an angiogenesis inhibitor, was heralded as the new magical cure. Well, first, it's not a magical cure for anything. But what they learned, patients could bleed out. You know, it prevents new blood cell formation, but it also has the effect that it interferes with bleeding, so patients can bleed, and they can die of bleeding from Avastin. So there are side effects like this. Each drug has a particular history of side effects, but they all have side effects, and very commonly they suppress the bone marrow, affect the liver, affect the kidneys, can affect bleeding, can affect thinking. One of the interesting syndromes is called chemo brain, which was first detected in women who were getting aggressive chemo for the treatment of breast cancer. And these women would complain that their cognitive function was diminished. They couldn't think, the memory was down, they couldn't remember names, and then, of course the oncologists would laugh and say, oh, it's just stress, you know, go on Valium or something. Well, it turned out this is a real syndrome where the chemo actually affects the neurological function in the brain and affects their cognitive ability. And it's very serious. I treat hundreds of patients with breast cancer, and many of them have had aggressive chemo before they came to see me, and virtually all of them complain to some extent of cognitive deficits. Fortunately, with good nutrition, those deficits can repair. Now, you asked an interesting question about what can be done if you're going to get chemo to protect against the side effects. Well, traditionally, even to this day, oncologists believe that nutrition is the enemy of chemotherapy, and they routinely recommend their patients not take any supplements, particularly not take the antioxidants. The mythology, and it is mythology, it's not based in science, is that antioxidants like selenium and vitamin E and vitamin C will block the effect of chemo and radiation. But actually, when you look at the original scientific literature, the exact opposite is true. Dr. Charles Simone at Princeton, New Jersey, has written a series of papers discussing that. He's actually scoured the literature and is probably the world's expert on the effect of antioxidants on chemo and radiation. The radiation oncologists believe the same thing, that antioxidants will block the effect of radiation. They believe that radiation works because it creates free radicals around the tumor, and antioxidants block free radicals, so they say antioxidants are the enemy of radiation. Turns out the opposite's true when you look at the scientific literature. It's always a good idea as a physician or scientist not to believe what you heard at a conference or what you heard from a friend who heard it from a friend who made it up. It's to actually go to the scientific literature, because you can learn a lot. And what Simone did is he reviewed hundreds of papers. Lo and behold, chemotherapy and radiation are not blocked by antioxidants, but actually their effect is greater and the side effects are less. People don't lose their hair, they don't go into kidney failure, they don't have bone marrow suppression. That the antioxidants not only help the chemotherapy work better and the radiation work better in terms of attacking the cancer directly, but block the terrible side effects. So all cancers should be on a very aggressive supplement nutritional program, but this will never get into the mainstream world the way oncologists currently think, because we hear this all the time. You can't take antioxidants, you can't take supplements, or you're getting chemo and radiation, it will knock it out, but that's not true. And Simone has published articles on this. Anyone who doubts that should go to the internet and look up Dr. Charles Simone.
People probably have heard that one of the main side effects of using chemotherapy is it actually causes cancer. But can you explain how that actually happens?
Many chemotherapeutic drugs are actually carcinogenic, and these are very toxic molecules. And a lot of the molecular biology, the way they work, has been worked out. Now, many chemotherapy drugs actually damage the DNA in cancer cells, which is how they kill the cancer cells. For example, there's a whole category of chemo drugs called alkylating agents, which damage the DNA of the cancer cells. Well, yeah, they do it in the cancer cells, but they will also do it to normal cells as well. They cause genetic mutations in normal tissue that can prove to be carcinogenic. The group at Stanford has been following patients so-called cured of Hodgkin's disease with aggressive chemo and radiation. They've studied over 1,200 patients over the last 25, 20 years. And what they've learned is that although these patients may be cured by the aggressive chemo and or radiation together, that up to 20 to 25% of them are developing secondary cancers, sometimes a couple years up to 20 years later, caused by the original chemo and radiation. You know, it's wonderful that patients with Hodgkin's disease can have an effect from chemo, again, to give the devil its due, and from radiation, but they're not without downside, and the downside often doesn't show up for many years. So the Stanford group is actually collecting, to their credit, a whole group of patient statistics on the so-called cures of Hodgkin's disease who develop secondary cancers. And usually the secondary cancers are extremely aggressive and treatment resistant. These patients die very quickly. So it's been documented and proven in the conventional medical literature that these drugs do produce cancer and extremely aggressive types of cancer.
Dr. Gonzalez, you were trained conventionally to treat cancer patients. What made you change that way of taking care of people?
Yeah, that's an interesting story. And my road in medicine certainly wasn't straightforward. As you know, I was a journalist before I went to medical school, and actually started doing a series of articles on medicine and cancer research. I got very interested in medical research, got to meet people unconventional like Linus Pauling, as well as conventional researchers, and decided I want to change careers and go into medical research, particularly cancer research. I had to do my pre-med work as a postgraduate student at Columbia, then got accepted to medical schools, and chose to go to Cornell because it was associated with Sloan Kettering here in Manhattan. And I wanted to spend the rest of my life in basic science research at Sloan Kettering. And as a second-year medical student at Cornell, Robert Good, at the time president of Sloan Kettering, kind of adopted me into his research group as his mascot, kind of. I was the young guy in the group, and he had all these highfalutin scientists working with him. But he kind of nurtured my career and spent a lot of time with me. And at the end of my second year of medical school, I had the opportunity to meet Dr. William Kelly, who was the eccentric dentist who developed this very aggressive nutritional enzyme detox program to treat cancer. And through one of my journalist contacts, I had a meeting with him because she was interested in doing a book on it. And I realized within 5 minutes of meeting him, even though what he did was so foreign to my conventional training, that he seemed to be very sincere and onto something. And I met with Dr. Good to talk about my meeting with Kelly, and he said, you know, this would make a great student project. Why don't you start going through Kelly's records? He said, even if it turns out to be a fraud and a charlatan, you'll learn a lot of medicine by doing a research study of your own devising. So the summer after my second year of medical school, I spent about 6 weeks going through Kelly's records and found case after case of appropriately diagnosed, biopsy-proven terrible cancer diagnosed at major institutions like metastatic pancreatic, metastatic breast, metastatic colon, who were alive 5 and 10 years later. And Kelly opened all his files to me, his successes. I really admired Kelly. Everything good and bad you hear about Kelly's true, but he was, in those days, he was really determined to have his work properly evaluated. Opened up all his records, didn't hide anything, allowed me to contact his patients that were happy to tell their stories. And at the end of that summer, 1981, Dr. Good said, well, we had a meeting and I showed him all these records that I put together from Dr. Kelly's files. At that point, Kelly lived in Dallas, Texas, and I brought him copies of the records back to New York. And Dr. Good said, why don't you just take this and run with it and do this, do this as a formal study. And eventually I finished my research into Kelly while I was doing my immunology fellowship training under Dr. Good, who by that time had moved down to Old Children's Hospital, kind of in semi-retirement. He supported my nutritional research. Meanwhile, I was learning how to do conventional oncology and bone marrow transplantation. Dr. Good did the first bone marrow transplant in history, 1969. And he taught me how to do bone marrow transplants, which is about as conventional oncology as you could imagine. And meanwhile, I'm doing that, my conventional training. Also, Good was supporting me in doing this nutritional research into this eccentric alternative practitioner, Dr. Kelly. And back in those days, in the mid-1980s, you know, if you mentioned nutrition and cancer in the same sentence, it was tantamount to a felony. You know, no one did it. You know, now there's a little bit more open-mindedness, although as the battles continue. But Dr. Good supported me for 5 years doing this study and put together a monograph, 500 pages long, where I discussed my investigation of Kelly, including 50 case reports of appropriately diagnosed patients with terrible cancer, including pancreatic, colon, metastatic breast, who had survived and done well, had tumor regression under his care. Initially we couldn't get it published, as you know, back in the 1980s, because no one could believe that an alternative therapy, nutritional therapy, could reverse cancer. Finally, in 2010, we published it, rewritten, updated with an introduction. But that's how it started, just a serendipitous meeting with Dr. Kelly, where I had to change my whole career from wanting to spend my life at Sloan Kettering. In fact, after I finished my training with Dr. Good, one of my professors at Cornell, two separate occasions, he worked at Sloan Kettering, but he was a professor at Cornell, offered me a job at Sloan Kettering twice. And I turned him down because I would have had to give up my unconventional research, and that's when I came to New York and opened my practice. So I had to turn down 2 jobs at Sloan Kettering, which should have assured a very comfortable, very nice, prestigious career without the political battles alternative therapists have to fight all the time because no one accepts their work. So I had to make a major career decisions, but when you're dealing with something that seems to be beneficial, if you're a true scientist, you don't turn back, you just go with it. And that's a decision I had to make.
So if somebody, after listening to this program, obviously they might be asking themselves, what else can they do? I mean, especially if that's all they've been told is to take surgery, chemotherapy, radiation. What are some of the natural alternative approaches that you recommend in your practice, Dr. Gonzalez?
Well, first become an educated consumer before you make your final decision. Of course, I admit I'm prejudiced. I like what I do, I believe in what I do. We see the results from what Kelly did 30 years ago, our own results of the last 26 years. One of the nice things about what I do, it's not an ego thing because I didn't develop this treatment. It was developed by really brilliant men who came before me. I'm a really good technician. I learned from great geniuses. Dr. Beard 100 years ago first suggested pancreatic enzymes have an anti-cancer effect. That was the genesis of Kelly's treatment, and he added a nutritional and detox component. But I basically taken what Kelly did, his achievements, and turned it into our practice today with great efficacy. So I believe in our therapy, and our therapy is 3-pronged, as you know. Individualized diet, every patient gets a diet designed for their needs. In the alternative world, there's a tendency to treat everyone the same. Pritikin, Ornish thinks everyone's a vegetarian. Atkins, whom I knew quite well, thought everyone should be on fatty red meat. The paleo diet, now everyone should be on fat. Or even at Stanford, who developed the Syndrome X, insulin resistance, thinks everyone should be on a balanced diet. Kelly realized different people need different diets. He had 10 basic diets that range from largely plant-based to red meat 2 or 3 times a day, and he had 94 variations of the 10 basic diets, and even then he would individualize the diet for each patient. We continue that tendency. We have 10 basic diets, dozens of variations, everything's individualized. Second component, large doses of supplements, vitamins, minerals, trace elements. Again, the supplement protocols are all individualized for each patient depending on their health history, their cancer, their metabolic efficiency, and in addition, large doses of pancreatic enzymes. We believe the vitamins, minerals, trace elements help the body repair and rebuild and help a damaged body, but we don't believe they have a particular anti-cancer effect. The main anti-cancer element in our program are large doses of these pancreatic enzymes, which are derived from the pig pancreas. Dr. Beard 100 years ago first suggested that pancreatic protein-digesting proteolytic enzymes have an anti-cancer effect. He wrote a book in 1911 on the enzyme treatment of cancer that should have changed the course of medical research, but like so many great geniuses, he was ignored. Kelly revived his work, and we keep it alive today using the enzymes to treat cancer. Third component of the detoxification routines, like controversial coffee enemas and liver flushes and juice fasts. As tumor breaks down and as the body repairs, all kinds of toxic metabolic waste is released that can make a patient sick. It's kind of like a tumor lysis syndrome, to use the word conventional oncologists use when chemo breaks a tumor down. Patients can die from chemo because at times when it works, like in Hodgkin's, if the tumor breaks down too fast, you have all this dead, poisonous tumor waste floating around the body, overloads the liver and the kidney, patients die. Well, with enzymes, you can have the same problem. So Kelly developed a whole series of techniques like liver flushes and the enemas that help the liver and the kidney work more efficiently so patients can get through these, quote, healing crises, end quote, as the body repairs and as tumors break down. The enzymes will break down tumors pretty quickly. Patients can get sick just as on chemo.
In a layman's terms, what do the pancreatic enzymes do to the cancer cell, for most of us to understand it?
We've never had the billions of dollars in research funding to do the elaborate molecular biology, but we've had some funding to do some animal studies. And they seem to just directly attack cancer. Now, Beard 100 years ago believed that cancer cells had an opposite charge than normal cells. So normal cells will repel pancreatic enzymes, which also have an electrical charge. But cancer cells have the opposite charge of normal cells, and the enzymes are attracted to them like a magnet, and they just attack the cell membranes. And cell membranes have all kinds of proteins on, and that's how cells survive, whether they're normal or cancer. And those proteins on cell membranes form pores that allow nutrients to get in, waste to get out, form communication systems so cells can communicate with each other. We believe the protein digesting enzymes destroy those proteins on the coat of the cell membrane of cancer cells, and the cells die. If those proteins are destroyed, the cells aren't going to live. Now, the normal cells repel the enzymes, so they're not affected.
Most people are paying for cancer treatments with their insurance programs, but chemotherapy is actually quite expensive, no?
Yeah, the idea that it's free because insurance pays for it, we're all paying for it. You know, it's not free, and people have no idea how expensive it is. I mean, in its worst form, a bone marrow transplant can cost up to $1 million, and it doesn't really work that much for most cancers. A drug like Avastin, which is heralded as the great advance, you know, even the FDA had to take it off the market for the treatment of breast cancer. They rescinded its approval for breast cancer because it wasn't working, even though doctors were using it. Avastin costs $10,000 a month. You know, one of the things I've always found ironic, coming out of a conventional Ivy League educated research background, I was hearing, you know, people go into alternative medicine because they want to make money. If you want to make money, you become a conventional oncologist. These guys are multimillionaires. They're oncology clinics that bring in millions of dollars. And these drugs are terribly expensive. And what patients do not realize, and the media does not realize, is oncologists are allowed to make money off the sale of chemo in their office. They have a vested interest in using these drugs, even in situations where it's not that effective, because they make money. The Wall Street Journal had an article several years ago pointing out that oncologists make hundreds of thousands of dollars each year themselves off of the sale of chemo in their office. For example, when you go to the oncologist, you know, you're in a treatment room with 15 other patients and the nurse is administering the chemo, but you don't realize that the oncologist is allowed to jack up the price of the drug and charge it to your insurance company. He pockets the profit. And they have a strong lobby in Washington, and they're not even required to tell the patient that they're making money off the sale of the chemo in their office. So it's all very quietly done. So oncologists are making a fortune out of this. And you have 15 patients getting Avastin, you know, it's $10,000 a month per patient. You can do the math. The fact that it doesn't work very well, that's a secondary issue, but it brings in the money. There are many well-intentioned oncologists. I know them, I have them as friends, but there's also a lot of collusion with the drug companies and the FDA and all that to get drugs approved that cost a lot of money that oncologists can charge to the insurance companies and make a fortune off of. Chemotherapy regimens can cost $50,000 to $100,000 for a single patient, even if it doesn't work. So there are treatments for pancreatic cancer, chemo treatments that are not effective. It costs $50,000 to $70,000. A Whipple procedure is the aggressive surgery for pancreatic cancer. Very few patients really are appropriate for that, and even the group that it's appropriate, only about 25% of the people that undergo Whipple have any kind of long-term survival. 75% die pretty quickly. Medicare allows a surgeon doing a Whipple $31,000 for just that surgical procedure. And that doesn't include the cost of the anesthesiologist and the nurses and the hospital stay and the food and the intravenous. That's just the doctor's fee, $31,000 that they pocket. Takes 2 or 3 hours. You do one a day, you figure, you do the math, you're making $150,000 a week. And a lot of doctors out there in the community hospitals are doing Whipples, and it doesn't work for most patients, and patients have no idea what the cost is. Medicare, which is known to be cheap, they're allowing $31,000 for a few hours of surgery. That doesn't work very well. So the cost of cancer therapy is enormous. It's estimated that chemo may be bringing up to $100 billion a year in the U.S. alone in terms of gross income. $100 billion a year, the costs. That's a lot of money.
So I know this is a tough question to answer, but a lot of people want to know, what are your results in your medical practice?
I guarantee if we weren't getting good results, I wouldn't be doing this. You know, I work long hours, stressful work, dealing with advanced cancer patients. If we weren't getting most of them well, I'd be doing something else. We're currently doing a book of 120 cases, actually be 2 volumes, case reports of our own patients. We thought, for some reason, 120 seemed like a good solid number of our own patients with the records to prove, and we'll protect the confidentiality, of course, and that will get the information out there. As you know, we've done clinical studies, we've had money to do animal studies. The well-done phase 2 pilot study that was published in 1999 with patients with advanced pancreatic cancer showed the best results in the history of medicine. Then we had the NCI study that was undermined, and that those results are meaningless. But we have patients with pancreatic cancer, for example, who have been with us 10, 15 years. Just yesterday, I talked to a wonderful Kelly patient. She was diagnosed in 1982, Appleton, Wisconsin. She had metastatic pancreatic cancer. They thought she had gallbladder disease, so they opened her up thinking they could take out the gallbladder. Lo and behold, she had a tumor in the pancreas, tumor in the liver. They biopsied the liver lesion. It was very aggressive pancreatic cancer, metastasized to the liver, closed her up. She went up to the Mayo Clinic where she met with an oncologist who was very honest and said chemo is going to be worthless in 1982. He said, just enjoy your time. That saved her life because when Mayo said they couldn't treat her, she started looking into alternatives, learned about Dr. Kelly, went on the Kelly program, Make a long story short, 31 years later, she's alive and well. Now, she's never had another CAT scan done because she doesn't want to see conventional doctors or have conventional tests. But I know of no patient in the history of medicine, and I've scoured the literature, diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, confirmed at the Mayo Clinic, alive 31 years later. In the GEMSAR clinical studies of pancreatic cancer in 1998, out of 126 patients, not a single patient lived longer than 19 months, and that was considered a great advance. So GEMSAR was approved for the treatment of pancreatic cancer, even though no one lived longer than 19 months.
I mean, isn't it true, conventionally speaking, they think it's such a great success if average treatments are 6 or 9 or 15 months. If they go one more month, it's like they go crazy, right?
In the GEMSAR study, the previous chemo had an average survival of 4.5 months, and GEMSAR had an average survival of 5.5 months. So a 1 month improvement in survival led to FDA approval, and it's now a billion-dollar-a-year industry based on 1 month improvement in survival, coupled with some minor improvement in quality of life. And here's a patient with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, alive 31 years later. I have a patient with pancreatic cancer, was diagnosed in January of 2001, 12 years ago. Stage 4, operated on at Washington Hospital in St. Louis, one of the great teaching centers in America. They thought he had gallbladder disease again, or hiatal hernia. They opened him up. 50% of his liver was involved with cancer. He had a 6-centimeter tumor in his pancreas. Biopsied the liver lesion, was a very aggressive, poorly differentiated pancreatic cancer. He did know about alternatives. He started chemo. Chemo doesn't work for that. They told him at best he might live 2 years. He got so sick on chemo, he stopped it, and he still had multiple tumors in his liver. Came to see me, and within about 1.5 years, all his liver tumors were gone, and I spoke to him recently. He's alive, over 12 years. He started with me in May 2001. Over 12 years ago with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. All his cancer regressed just on our treatment. So there's an example of somebody with terrible disease. I know of no patient with a disease like that, with that extent of cancer, biopsy proven in a major academic teaching center, alive 12 years later with total regression of the disease on our therapy. So we have many patients like that, and we finally decided, we're on our own. We can't expect the government regulatory authorities to help us get the word out. So we're doing it ourselves. We're doing 120 cases of patients like these with terrible cancer, appropriately diagnosed, biopsy proven at major institutions, who had regression of disease and long-term survival. I've been doing this 26 years. I have patients been with me 25, 26 years now.
But I know you're the first one to admit this kind of protocol that you've been describing in this program and all the other great information you've been giving us, it's not for everybody to do your treatment plan. What do you say to those people?
Absolutely, it's not for everybody. I agree 100%. It's maybe for a small population of people. It should be available to the people who want it. But yes, this requires that patients take responsibility for their own health. They're doing the therapy at home. Chemotherapy is very passive. You go to the oncologist's office, the nurse sits you in the chair, gives you some ice cream or chocolate bar, and they have candy everywhere. You put out your arm, you get the IV, and you sit there watching TV, chatting to the other patients getting chemo. It's very passive. They don't tell you to change your diet. They don't. In fact, they tell you to eat junk food to keep your calories up. Our therapy is completely different. You have to change your lifestyle, eat organically, whatever the diet is. You have to eat organically, follow the regimen exactly as prescribed, take 200 capsules of supplements a day through the day, in the middle of the night, do the coffee enemas and all of those things. So it takes a patient who's going to be really devoted, dedicated, and has no problem with compliance. And that's why faith is so important. If you don't believe in this, you're not going to do the work. You really have to believe that this is what you need to do to get well. And we've noticed, the patients that do the best are the ones that come in with this positive attitude, even though they have terrible cancer, that this is what they want to do, this is what they're going to do, and they follow the program. A lot of patients aren't going to have that discipline. We have patients call us. Will you treat us? It turns out they're smoking and they're drinking. And the answer is no. If you're smoking, if you can't give up smoking, how are you going to do my therapy? You don't have the discipline. They don't belong here. They belong with Sloan Kettering. So it isn't for everybody. We acknowledge that. And if patients want to do chemo, as we talked earlier, that's what they should do. If they want to do radiation, they should go do that. This is for people who really have an orientation toward good nutrition, understand its importance, and that it really resonates with them. And this is what they're going to do. And if they're going to comply with it, and those are the ones that always do the best.
I don't know what else to say except thank you very much, Dr. Gonzalez.
Thank you. Always great to talk to you.
Yeah, it's great. And I hope you agree. This was a lot of great information. Please watch this as many times as you like. I hope you also get a chance to show this to your family and friends, those that want to listen to this. And thanks again for joining us. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.